In this video, we're going to look at the second part of the Operation Hummingbird film that was created by Cheshire Police. It's notable that there are only 37 comments on this video to this day, which is because they delete all comments that are even remotely negative. Otherwise, there would be thousands of comments by now. Similarly, as I've pointed out previously, Cheshire Police have stopped updating their Twitter profile on the 8th of December 2024. This is despite the fact that previously they'd posted 48.2 thousand times. Again, there is a very simple reason for this. They cannot control comments on Twitter because you can't delete comments, and they would be absolutely inundated with negative comments related to the Lucy Letby inquiry. So they've just chosen not to post, which is, I think, pretty disgraceful because they're supposed to be posting on Twitter to provide a service to the local community, which they obviously took seriously previously because they posted over 48,000 times. But on the 8th of December 2024, they just suddenly decided, oh, we're taking our ball home and we're not playing anymore. So we don't hear anything from Cheshire Police now, let alone do they answer any questions. They don't even fulfil their own basic duties as a police constabulary anymore. Now, I often mention the fact that this film made by Cheshire Police is not a documentary as they claim. So I just wanted to show you this quote from, this was I believe on Radio 4, but it's a BBC radio programme called The Media Show. And this was broadcast on the 23rd of August 2023. And on that date, the award-winning documentary filmmaker Patrick Forbes spoke to the BBC and this Media Show programme and made the following comments about what I call the Operation Hummingbird promotional film. He said this: "Well, I was worried actually when I saw it, and I thought, well, first of all, it isn't a documentary, because sure, in one sense, they're telling what they saw as happening, but at no stage does any hostile or probing question come in and say, but hang on, was that a mistake? Should you have done that? There's no sense in which there's any scrutiny in it. The British public is not being served because you don't get awkward characters like me going, hang on, what happened there? And that's frankly all our loss." What Mr. Forbes, whose views I endorse entirely here, perhaps doesn't realise is that the police I'm sure he does realise this to a certain extent, but I think even he couldn't possibly imagine how incompetent Operation Hummingbird had been. So he doesn't realise that they don't want awkward characters asking questions because they probably know deep down. I'm sure they thought they'd done a valid investigation, but they probably know deep down we can't actually answer questions from awkward characters. We're just not capable of it. So we'll make our own film where we ask our own questions and then answer our own questions. So that's why they did that. That's why there's no scrutiny. And the Cheshire Police have made it clear in numerous ways that they don't consider themselves to be accountable. They've made this clear by, as I say, deleting all negative comments. They've made this clear by just halting their Twitter. It's now 14 months. Well, it's 13, isn't it? 'Cause we're in January. It's 13 months since they posted on Twitter, and they just halted their Twitter account because they know they'd be getting an absolute hammering on Twitter. They wrote to the Mail on Sunday after Peter Hitchens wrote an article that was critical of them, and then they said, well, now you should write a positive article. And as I said before, I think they're actually too ignorant to understand why it's problematical for them to write to the Mail on Sunday or contact the Mail on Sunday, biggest circulation British newspaper, I believe, and say, oh, you should write something positive about the police. They're probably, it seems to me, that they're ignorant enough and stupid enough not to understand why that is troubling. But I just wanted to include this bit because I was going to write this in my book. It's in an earlier draft, and then I cut it out because essentially it's an extraneous comment. But I just wanted to show that even on the BBC, they allowed this comment saying, well, it's not a documentary, and here's why it's not a documentary. So please don't allow anyone to tell you that this film is a documentary. It's not. So I began my analysis of this not documentary in this previous video. What did Cheshire Police say about Lucy Letby investigation? So you can go back and look at that and look at the first part of Operation Hummingbird's promotional film and my analysis of it in that video. So we're going to continue here and carry on where we left off in this second part of analysis. So the second part begins with our favourite Cheshire Police officer, Paul Hughes, who says the following. So the three things we wanted to try and draw together was medically what happened. Do we have a murder? Do we have a naturally occurring death? So the obvious thing that I would say immediately in response to that is that you made almost no effort whatsoever, and as far as I can see, literally no effort whatsoever, to actually investigate anything other than the hypothesis that Lucy Letby was guilty. So the idea that you challenged the notion that there may have been a murder is completely without foundation as far as we can see based on everything that you've released into the public domain. It's also very odd, really, if you think about this as being illustrative of his thought process at the time, that you'd place murder so high on the list. So let's try to draw together what was happening medically. Do we have a murder? Would that be the usual chain of thinking in a hospital? Now, seemingly this did happen in the County Chester Hospital, but it's then the police's job to unpick this and indeed question the people, as we're going to discuss later, who walked into the police station and made what were very thinly veiled accusations. The other thing that we know now is that Dr. Evans hand-waved the idea that all of these different experts should be included in the investigation. Now, I've always believed that what happened, considering that the investigation was so incompetent, and considering the medical and scientific information that was put in court was so poor, I had always believed previously that Dr. Evans had run the whole investigation. That he'd somehow said to the police, oh look, just leave it all to me, this is the best way for it to happen. And that is basically exactly what occurred. There is an email from Dr. Evans where he talks about, oh yeah, the best thing you can possibly do is this, and it's a lengthy email where he tells the police what to do. I had presumed and I had surmised that the police had just accepted that and done as they were told, which is exactly what had happened. I didn't realise that the National Crime Agency had also informed them exactly what they needed to do, which, to be fair to Dr. Stephen Brearey, even he, in the 15th of May meeting, cited the need for a multidisciplinary panel. However, even after that could have passed them by very quickly. If they were intelligent, it wouldn't have passed them by very quickly, but clearly that's not an issue for them. So that could have passed them by very quickly, that one comment from Dr. Brearey, even though they did put it in the notes, so we can see that, even though they didn't minute the meeting. But they made notes, so we know that was said. But they were told this very explicitly in an email from the National Crime Agency, and it seems that they completely ignored this and allowed Evans to hand-wave all of that and run the investigation on his own. And then when they first arrested Lucy Letby, only Dr. Evans had looked at the notes and done any work whatsoever. And then it hardly need be mentioned that, of course, we know, even for the collapses that are in the court case, Lucy wasn't on duty all the time. And even if she had been on duty all the time, we know for a fact that there are loads of people around her for numerous collapses, for numerous infants. And sometimes there's just a screen separating her from other nurses and such like. And we've seen how cramped the neonatal unit is. We've seen the very small gaps. And the corridor just runs straight past the nurseries, and so on. So to say that it's statistically proven that Lucy Letby was there all the time and it couldn't possibly be anyone else, we know that this is rubbish. It's total rubbish at this point. It's indefensible. It just cannot be defended. And then on top of that, even in the summing up of the judge, in his final summing up, he conceded that there were medical reasons for at least some of the collapses. And he also conceded later on that Lucy Letby wasn't around for all of the collapses. But that's known to be the case anyway. And then on top of that, let's not forget that there were many, many other collapses on this unit. And we also know now that contrary to what Dr. Evans has claimed previously, he earmarked several of these collapses as being suspicious. Then they were mysteriously withdrawn from the case. Indeed, we know infants were moved in and out of the case at various times despite his previous claims. So that all adds up to a pretty dubious assertion from Mr. Hughes that it could only have been Lucy Letby, and Lucy Letby was present all the time, and this is therefore some legitimate form of evidence. It's not legitimate evidence, it's total crap. So then we move on to Claire Hocknell, who introduces herself as one of the intelligence analysts on Operation Hummingbird. And Claire says, as an analyst, I would have been in the past expected to take part in strategic work in terms of establishing threat areas across the force, but also deployed to operational responsibilities. So in turn, if there was a series of burglaries or a drugs conspiracy, I'd be involved in looking at the data behind which supported that investigation and trying to really interrogate that data, see what it tells us, what evidence it gives us, and put that into a product to help the investigation team. So I'm going to be reflecting on that in a second, but I'm just going to finish reading this statement out first. If it's a proactive job, or if it was reactive, putting together a product so that the investigation team, any Crown Prosecution Service, and then ongoing on into the court process can actually understand that information, preparing a sequence of events which may involve call logs. It might be maps of locations, it might include CCTV, but this job hasn't been like that. Primarily it was a case of looking at what data was available at that time. So let's rewind to this comment where she's talking about burglaries and drugs conspiracies. So the key thing to note about burglaries and drugs conspiracies, as she describes it, is that a crime has been committed. That is undeniable because there's loads of money, there's like millions of pounds or tens of thousands of pounds or hundreds of thousands of pounds in banknotes, there's loads of drugs, or someone's house has been broken into and stuff has been taken out of it. So we have a very established crime that has taken place, that's undeniably taken place. The problem here is that this intelligence analyst is analysing what they believed to be a crime that actually does not exist. So she has been used, essentially, to prove this hypothesis that it's always Lucy, it has to be Lucy, it could only possibly be Lucy. And as we've seen from Paul Hughes just a couple of comments previously, we had a really open mind, but the first thing I want to say is, we quickly worked out there was always Lucy on duty, and was it really a murder or was it not a murder? Well, we couldn't tell, but we very quickly decided it was a murder. So Claire Hocknell is looking at this as if it's a drugs conspiracy, she describes it, or a burglary, when what it is natural causes and medical errors in a hospital. So she is applying her usual methodology to something where what the police should have been doing is establishing whether or not a crime had taken place. Unfortunately, it seems like they had no ability, no competence, and in fact, no clue how to go about doing that. Or if they did, then they didn't demonstrate that in any way during the investigation. So then Claire Hocknell goes on to say the following. Mainly it was, and it still is, medical records, as you'd probably expect from a hospital, you'd have to say. I soon found out that a lot of that medical data was scanned in PDF format, and it was just going to be a manual extraction of data. So I remember when I first read this, which was over 2 years ago now, I thought, why has Claire telling us about the document format made the final cut? It seems to me that we didn't really need to hear about the fact that it was scanned in PDF format. But that's a moot point. So she continues. So I just had to apply the methodology to just reading through and picking it out manually. As I've already mentioned, the problem is you applied your normal methodology to a situation in which you should have been investigating whether or not a crime took place. What you did was you applied your methodology which you usually apply when you know that a crime has been taken place, and you applied it to this situation where you didn't know that a crime had taken place. So Claire continues, with this investigation, is that your subconscious is constantly searching for a reason for it not to be her. Even you go months just methodically working through overlaying, creating sequences, and then you read something and it just rings you a bit, and you think, gosh, she really has done this. So I will comment on this. Obviously, Claire here is trying to suggest that she was as neutral and objective as possible, and to be honest, that's to her credit. We don't see that from Paul Hughes very much. It shouldn't really, though. The first thing I'll say is it shouldn't really be your subconscious that is constantly searching for a reason for it not to be her. That should be your conscious mind. And it shouldn't be Lucy Letby on trial anyway. You're supposed to be looking at whether or not there were crimes in this hospital. The initial letter that was sent to Cheshire Police asked you to exclude unnatural causes. Let me repeat that for you, Claire. Exclude unnatural causes. You're not supposed to be going through this methodology, as you describe it, of trying to work out whether it's Lucy Letby who's committed loads of murders. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. And yes, your subconscious should be searching for a reason for it not to be her. And it shouldn't be your subconscious, it should be your conscious mind. You should be consciously seeking other avenues of investigation. You should have been looking into the background of the consultants. You should have been finding out what occurred at the hospital. You should have been looking at Lucy's grievance procedure. All of these things we're going to discuss later in this video. But all your comments here indicate is that you did an incompetent job. And I don't say that to be horrible to Claire Hocknell. I mean, I don't even wish to be horrible to Paul Hughes. I'm sure he tried his best. He obviously struggled. They struggled to run this investigation. They did a terrible job. There are comments in Operation Hummingbird that I don't think we will cover in this video because I think it's in a later portion, where they indicate they're proud of their investigation. They worked very hard on it, and I'm sure that's true. And I'm sure that they went through a lot of harrowing experiences, but they did a lousy job. And that is their job. They're in a responsible position, an important position, and they have to be able to accept constructive criticism. The fact is, this investigation was fatally flawed from the outset, as Dr. Steve Watts has told you previously, as Stephanie Davies has told you previously, as I'm sure eventually whistleblowers from inside Cheshire Police will tell you. I'm not in contact with any currently, I'm not implying that I am, but I'm sure one day we're going to hear from them. And, you just have to take that on the chin, unfortunately. I don't say it to be horrible, and I have nothing against any of them personally, even Mr. Hughes. I've got nothing against him personally. But, he has behaved like a bit of an idiot in the media, and it's not unreasonable for me to point that out. Quite the opposite. So I'll just read out the last part of this section. And you kind of have to separate yourself out from how you feel about it, just like you've got to do the work. You've got to give it justice as to what's happened. You've got to remain impartial, and that's how I've managed to continue for nearly 6 years that I've been working on it. So that's kind of a heroic effort from Claire to try and assert that Cheshire Police remain neutral and that they didn't get emotionally involved. Unfortunately, what we've seen elsewhere, even in the previous section, as we're going to see in future sections of the Operation Hummingbird promotional film, it's very obvious that they did become emotionally involved. We're going to see that later in this section, but the idea that this was an impartial, objective investigation of the hospital in which they made a thorough attempt to exclude unnatural causes, and the only possible conclusion was that Lucy Letby was guilty of deliberately harming these infants, and that they remained neutral at all times and never allowed, for example, speaking with the families to affect them emotionally. It's just not tenable, unfortunately. So now we're going to return to Mr. Hughes, who says the following. Now, I want to be clear that I've just transcribed it as it was said. I'm going to declare now its criminality. Tell parents, so we're going to bring parents in and tell them for the first time we think their baby's been murdered and attempted to be murdered. Many with twins, triplets, siblings, all affected. So I won't say too much about that. It's a kind of banal statement, but I suppose what I would say is that it's an appeal to emotion. Many with twins, triplets, siblings, all affected. I accept there would be an emotional situation, but I just wanted to point out that that's just essentially an appeal to emotion. So Michelle Burkett speaks, and she's going to introduce herself formally, I think, in the next comment. So she says, we initially went out to speak to, I think, about 28 families then. So that's interesting, obviously, because they spoke to many more families than ultimately occurred in the court case. So Dr. Evans said, again, let me remind you, he claimed, it was really, really, really easy for me to rule out collapses of infants where it was not suspicious, even though we know for a fact from his notes now that's not true. But the fact that they interviewed 28 families would tend to rather jar against that claim as well. So then Michelle Burkett continues, and we were all given formal words to explain to the families that there will be an investigation from this period of time, and your child was born there, or sadly, some of them passed away there, and we would be looking into the circumstances around that. So I asked Dr. Steve Watts about this as well, and he said that the police are kind of obliged to speak to the families, so that's fair enough. I will accept for the sake of argument, because I can't say otherwise, that in that initial statement, what Michelle Burkett has mentioned here seems reasonable, and I will assume for the sake of argument that what she's saying is accurate. I think there are very serious question marks regarding what happened later on. But I'll just continue with Michelle Burkett's comments. So the next thing she just did was introduce herself as a family liaison officer and a family liaison coordinator. And again, she claims the families were told very little at the beginning because we didn't know anything at the beginning. So I cannot disprove that. I will assume for the sake of argument that what she's saying is true. So then we move on to Paul Hughes. So it very quickly goes from Michelle Burkett saying, we didn't tell them anything, honest, to Paul Hughes saying, horrific for the parents to have to deal with because, in my view, in a case that's gone on like this for so long, they've dealt with the loss of their child and then again and again and again, more trauma each time we do something, each time we arrest. Absolutely, Paul. There's no doubt whatsoever that you've caused them enormous trauma. I'm glad that you're self-aware enough to realise that. Each time we make a decision, each time we charge, parents reliving that point. So then he goes on to make this statement here. A difficult decision to make, in fact, the hardest decision to make of my career. I think it's fair to say by that time, and probably still do I arrest Lucy Letby for multiple murders and attempted murders? So in a later section, we're going to revisit this because it's not going to be in this particular section, but Paul Hughes talked about this in more depth later on, and he makes some incredibly disingenuous comments about the arrest of Lucy Letby. But I think even this is disingenuous because when he was interviewed by Liz and Caroline, he basically indicated that he'd already made his mind up by 2018 when they arrested Lucy for the first time. What he says later on is he makes all these comments about, Lucy knew more about the case than anyone else, so we had to speak to her for that reason. That would be a reason to obviously to invite her to the police station, not arrest her, and it would also be a reason to pay attention to what she said, which we know for a fact you didn't do. Here, this isn't a difficult decision. Again, this is completely disingenuous because you basically immediately jumped to the conclusion it was murder on the say-so of the consultants and Dr. Danielle Evans. You didn't investigate any other possibilities. You let Dr. Evans build the case on his own. You didn't have anyone else look at it at all. You ignored the National Crime Agency. And then, by your own words, you already jumped to the conclusion that Lucy Letby was guilty when she was first arrested. So to describe that as an incredibly hard decision is generous to describe it disingenuous, because if you seriously suspected that Lucy Letby was guilty of multiple murders and attempted murders, of course you have to arrest her. Of course you do. And you jumped to that conclusion by that time because you never investigated or examined anything else. And you allowed Dr. Evans to run the whole investigation. We know that for a fact now. Frankly, it was really obvious anyway, and I had long since surmised that this was the case, but now we have it in black and white. So then, this is the only appearance in this section of Simon Blackwell, who was the strategic lead. He'd already appeared in the first part of this documentary, so he doesn't... So I shouldn't use the term documentary. It's a promotional film. He's already appeared in the first part of this promotional film, so he doesn't introduce himself. So Simon Blackwell says, so come to 2018, we were at the point in the summer where we were in a decision where we had a suspect. We believed there was criminality that had happened against a number of babies. So he's just confirmed. So what Paul Hughes just said, it was so difficult. It was so difficult to decide whether or not to arrest Lucy Letby. Well, actually, in the very next comment, Simon Blackwell's going to say, we already knew we had a suspect. We already knew there was criminality. So it wasn't a difficult decision, was it, Paul? That was just bullshit, essentially. It's so funny, it's like, he literally makes a statement, and then in the very next statement in the film, sometimes it's him making the statement, this time it's Simon Blackwell. It just completely contradicts what he'd said previously. Just like Dewey makes a statement, and then later on he'll contradict it. So I'll go on to look at the next comment. And the next stage, then, balancing risk and reward, was to arrest and effect an arrest, and against, potential ramifications of saying publicly, because the arrest would become public, that we have a child serial killer, so this is not something that you want to get wrong. Well, as you'd already made your mind up by that stage, I'm not sure what you were so concerned about. So then there's some stock footage of Lucy being arrested. There's just a voiceover that says, "We have today arrested a healthcare professional. She was arrested this morning on suspicion of the murder of 8 babies, the attempted murder of a further 6, and currently remains in custody. The families were all told at the first arrest." Of course, Dewey managed to tack on a few more after this arrest, a few more babies. Then we go back to Michelle Burkett, who's talking about the families now. "You're knocking on the door and you're turning their life back upside down again." So they didn't just go back once, it was like again and again and again. Let's just update you about the investigation. So it's incredibly hard to believe that they haven't prompted some of the responses from the parents. But let's continue. "They've already gone through the bereavement of saying goodbye to their lost child, and then you're knocking on the door and telling them, well, somebody's responsible for your baby not being here anymore, or somebody's responsible for what's happened to your daughter or son and the condition that they're in now." So in response to that, I want to make it clear. There's a lot of media comment, and understandably so, that the parents and the families have been put through a traumatic experience, and no right-thinking person could possibly disagree with that. So I want it to be understood, it is the police that have put them through this experience. If the police were competent, they still would have been through a traumatic experience, because they would have been through the hospital experience, which it was awful for many of these parents, but it's been made magnitudes worse, been amplified beyond belief by the police, and they're acknowledging that here. It's ironic that in the previous statement, one of the officers says, we didn't want to get things wrong, but they've got things spectacularly wrong. And they knew, Michelle Burkett knew, we're making things worse and worse and worse for these parents. And if only they'd run a competent investigation, this would never have happened. But they were singularly unable to do that, seemingly. So Michelle Burkett continues, "Their reactions vary, disbelief some of them, because some of the families had gone on and raised money for charity for the unit and just couldn't believe that somebody could be, responsible for what's happened to them." So it is awful. I mean, that is an awful thing to read and hear. I'm sure the families are great people. Clearly those that have raised money for charity and for the unit are wonderful people, but I'm sure they all are. And it's awful that they've been upset in this way, and it was all completely avoidable. All it needed was for the police to run a competent investigation, and indeed to do what they'd been asked to do by the hospital. They were asked to exclude unnatural causes. They had 3 executives in their police station on the 12th of May telling them there was no reason to have an investigation. They themselves concluded that there was no reason for investigation. Then Nigel Wenham and Paul Hughes allowed Brearey, Jayaram, and to a lesser extent Susie Holt to walk into Blacon police station 3 days after that and just feed them. I have described it generously as information of varying degrees of accuracy, most of it inaccurate. And then they just did a 180-degree turn, virtually overnight. And as a consequence of this, these parents have been enormously traumatised, whereas if Cheshire Police had just been competent, this would never have happened, and they'd still be completing their Twitter account. So as a reminder, let's just go over how critical the police were of paediatricians, in this case a retired paediatrician, that came into their police station. Firstly, Dr. Danielle Evans said that he suspected foul play within 10 minutes, although he didn't know a crime had been committed at that point because, he was only on his way to the police station, having contacted them through the National Crime Agency. And then, obviously, in Panorama, he indicates that it was less than 10 minutes. So 10 minutes is the maximum where he decided that it was inflicted harm. So they were completely credulous with regard to that, and they were completely credulous when Stephen Brearey, Ravi Jayaram, and Susie Holt walked into the police station on the 15th of May, and they identified Lucy Letby. And then you can see the headline there. 3 days later, they'd already reported it to The Guardian. So it's likely they reported it within 2 days, because The Guardian published it on the 18th. So they may have published it the same day that they received the information, but it's also, I would say, probable that as it was published quite early in the day on the 18th of May, that they received it on the 17th of May. So within 2 days, they'd gone for, we're not doing an investigation, to let's tell The Guardian we're doing a massive investigation. That's how credulous they were. That's how competent they were. Not particularly competent. So we'll return to Michelle Burkett, who says the following. And then some of the families, I knew something was wrong. So Michelle, with her incredible powers of deduction, knew something was wrong. Or maybe this is her saying the families knew something was wrong, because she then goes on to say, I knew something wasn't right. I knew my child was not right. So I assume when she's saying I knew something was wrong, that's her quoting the families. She doesn't make it entirely clear. But it's fairly extraordinary that this is being cited as a form of legitimate evidence. So they kind of poked the families repeatedly by their own admission and prompting them more and more and more. And so they went from a position of initially not suspecting a single thing. As you've described yourself, Michelle, some of them were fundraising for the unit because they wrongly believed the unit had done a good job. And I'm sure the unit tried the hardest, as I've said numerous times. But they didn't do a good job in all cases, that's for sure. So they went from that, from not suspecting a thing. They clearly never suspected a problem with any of the nurses. And some of the nurses, some of the parents rather, had very good relationship with Lucy and other nurses on the unit. But so you've poked them with a stick repeatedly until the families are sitting there saying, I knew something was wrong, I knew something wasn't right, I knew my child was not right, and then Michelle Burkett is citing that as being meaningful evidence. So this is a classic example of confirmation bias, the human tendency to seek, interpret, favour and recall information that confirms or supports pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses, while ignoring or downplaying contradictory evidence. And when that's mixed with memory, you suddenly get your memory making false memories of things that never actually occurred or that are of no significance, because your memory starts to fill in the gaps and try to make them fit with the pattern of this emotional thing that's now coming into your consciousness. That you've been, as I say, poked with a stick repeatedly until you start thinking, actually, one day Lucy, and you see the things that are said about Lucy. It's these incredibly trivial things like, oh, her expression was slightly glum one time, or another time it'd be like, oh, she was smiling, or I thought she said this inappropriately, or I thought she did that inappropriately. It was all complete nonsense because no one saw her do anything wrong. But the police and these so-called family liaison officers, they went round and round and round over and over and over again until such time as they started saying, well, actually, Lucy said this and I thought that was really strange. And we know as well, a lot of the things that they said were perfectly normal things for nurses to do, just like this box in the Channel 4 so-called documentary, where they said, oh, yeah, it was really weird. Well, actually, it's not weird because it happens all the time. But hey, we'll just make 15 minutes out of this for the documentary. And ultimately, it ends up with this very strange two-way feedback loop in which the police basically tell them, we think someone has murdered your child. And the parents say, oh, because you told us that, we think someone has murdered our child. And now the police are telling us, because the parents have told us that, we think someone has murdered your child. And it goes round and round in circles in this very bizarre way. Ultimately, the situation you have here is that the police already have the pre-existing notion that there is a murderer, because Derry Evans has told them this in 10 minutes at the absolute most. Then the police feed this to the families, polluting their impression of events at the unit. So the police are tainting their memories of what occurred, which we know for certain because no one made any complaints or had any suspicions at the time that these unfortunate events took place. What occurs instead is that the police trigger emotional responses which actually serve a self-preservational function for the parents, who can now lean into the idea that there was malfeasance rather than thinking that they passed on some sort of genetic cause or tendency to struggle physically to their infants. Then the police interview the families, and having polluted their perspective, they then use the unfounded recollections that the families feed back to them as evidence that their suspicions about Lucy Letby are correct. It's this incredibly bizarre, circuitous, two-way feedback loop, and it says a lot that the so-called intelligence analyst and the so-called family liaison officers cannot see the chronic confirmation bias that is inherent in this entire process. So we'll return to the previous comments of Michelle Burkett. So she explains, family liaison officers were brought in as a point of contact between the family and the investigation, rather than a family member having 12 different detectives phoning them with 12 different bits of information. They have a single point of contact. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. I wouldn't be critical of that at all. So then we hear from Danielle Stonier, who's also a family liaison officer. Now, Danielle's a friend of ours already because she appeared in this video, What Did Lucy Letby Police Interviewer Say About Her?, in which she was part of a Daily Mail podcast. Now, we learnt in that particular interview, in that particular podcast, that Danielle Stonier conducted 2/3 of the interviews of Lucy Letby, interviewing her in 2019 and 2020. So that's already, in my view, and in many people's view, a massive conflict of interest. But we'll move on to what Danielle Stonier says in this portion of the Operation Hummingbird promotional film. So Danielle says, you are the link between the investigation and the families involved, so the victim's side of the family. I'm Detective Sergeant Danielle Stonier. I've got 18 years service and I currently work on Operation Hummingbird. It's a difficult and challenging role, but also really rewarding as well. You might reflect on that differently in the years to come, Danielle. So you're there to kind of keep them updated about the investigation, speak to them, and gain any evidence that they've got to offer if you need to get statements. A lot of these families haven't had any involvement with the police in general, let alone an investigation. So it's about making sure they understand every step of the process and feel supported and that they feel informed. So there's nothing particularly unreasonable here. All I would say is that Danielle Stonier clearly has a close relationship with the parents, as you would expect as being the family liaison officer. It's therefore, in my opinion, deeply inappropriate for her to interview Lucy Letby, because she already has a vested interest, she already has a perspective, she's already made her mind up, even before they arrested Lucy the first time, I would suggest. But then you could say that for most of Cheshire Police. So then Michelle Burkett goes on to say this. It's not all done on day one, it's done in little steps. First, initial contact is made, and sometimes you can be the one that's actually breaking the news that you're knocking on the door of somebody. You're very aware that you're going to change their life forever. You are giving them bad news that their son has been killed, and you take them through the whole process to visiting them in the mortuary, explaining the circumstances of how they have died. In this particular incident and investigation, a lot of the family liaison officers didn't have to do that. It was more about explaining to the families what's happening, when it's happening, and why the period of time is sometimes lengthy. So it's clear that they have updated the families repeatedly, long before we get to the point where they start saying, as Michelle has recounted previously, oh actually, yeah, I remember some suspicious things. It's because they've constantly been saying, oh, this has happened, this has happened, this has happened, we're doing this, we suspect this, and they've prompted them. I've described it previously as polluted their perspective, and that's entirely fair. I do have some experience of this, not direct experience, but someone who's close to me, I can't really discuss the circumstances, but the person in question said to me, the police just won't leave me alone. I've said, please will you leave me alone? I don't, all you're doing is upsetting me. I don't want you to phone me anymore. And she said that, they just don't leave you alone. So they may believe they're doing the right thing. They may be doing what they're trained to do, but I think it's very clear in this case that they've had a significant impact on the way that the families have perceived the incident. And then ultimately, they've started saying kind of speculative things to the police, and then the police have used this, the family liaison officers, to confirm their own perspective, and then they've even fed that into the court case. It's a fairly extraordinary, as I say, circuitous process. So finally, in this section, Danielle Stonier says the following. I've been a family liaison officer for a number of years, and no job has been the same, and no family has been the same that I've supported, and it can look very differently. Doesn't entirely make sense, but never mind. People's needs are very different, so it's really important to kind of set out an understanding at the start so they're aware of what they can expect from me, but also what I will be looking at from them. So it could be something simple as, how often do you want me to phone you to check in? Do you want to be contacted every week, even if I've got no information? Do you still want a call, or, do you just want me to call you with any pertinent points? So there's nothing particularly wrong about this. It reflects what I've said previously about how, if you're in these circumstances, the police won't leave you alone, essentially. But leaving that issue aside, the only thing I would like you to reflect on, and this applies to the entirety of this portion of the film, but also the film as a whole, is the emphasis that the police placed on the families. Now, there's no doubt that if the police genuinely believe that there's been murders at the hospital, that the families clearly are an interested party, to put it mildly. However, they're not a customer of the police. It's not the job of the police to satisfy the families and get a result for the families in the way that Amazon has customers or Tesco has customers. The police have numerous stakeholders, and sometimes they have to disappoint one of the stakeholders and say, you know what, I know we've phoned you up a lot of times, I know we've contacted you a lot of times, but it turns out there aren't any murders at this hospital. So hopefully, obviously they'd handle it sensitively and say, hopefully you find that reassuring, because it means that the passing of your child was unavoidable, or rather, more accurately in this case, there were medical blunders. I guess it was asking too much for the police to work that out, but that certainly Cheshire Police were unable to investigate this case and look at the various avenues of investigation that they should have explored. So there was an enormous emphasis in this film, and as I said this in the first part of this series, that the documentary begins with them talking about the families immediately. They could have begun with anything, but they're immediately talking about the families, and we feel so happy we've got a result for the families and all this kind of thing, which is not what they're supposed to be doing. In fact, let me remind you again, and let remind them again, what they're supposed to be doing is excluding unnatural causes. That's what they're supposed to be doing, not making the families of the infants happy by telling them that someone's murdered their children and now we're going to get a result for you by banging her away. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. So this unhealthy emphasis, and we'll see in later parts, they start talking about how emotionally affected they were, how upsetting it was to see the families. It becomes more and more obvious that they became emotionally involved with the families, and they increasingly, certainly in this promotional film, they pitched it very strongly as being, we got a result for the families, and that's what was important. And they seem to have completely misunderstood that that's not what they were supposed to be doing, and it's not really even appropriate in this film for it to be emphasised in that way. They should be looking at the multiple stakeholders and the multiple things that they're supposed to do and the multiple avenues of investigation, and then competently investigating those avenues by uncovering information. And they never did any of that. It's so blindingly obvious that they very quickly decided that there was something suspicious going on. They very quickly followed what the consultants told them in the 15th of May meeting, where they identified Lucy completely, and then they went out to prove that hypothesis, and they never really even considered anything else. And certainly from July, when Dr. Dewi Evans turned up and told them immediately, oh, it's definitely inflicted harm, just give me the notes and I'll work it out on my own. We don't need anyone else, don't worry. From that point on, they were completely credulous, and from that point on, there was definitely no attempt whatsoever to investigate any other avenues. So the fact that in this film they're talking about the family so much, and they do that more and more as it continues, this is actually a relatively small amount in this part. Later on, it's just the entire focus of the film. The fact they're doing that so much is indicative of the fact that they became emotionally involved with these families and they wanted to get a result for them. And that was one of the factors that fed into the overall reality of this investigation, which is they make some kind of pathetic lip service to the idea, oh, we didn't want to jump to any conclusions, but then we blatantly jump to conclusions. In summary, virtually everything that Cheshire Police say and do, certainly with regard to Operation Hummingbird, is the reverse of what one would and should expect. They invite no scrutiny and consider themselves unaccountable when they are a publicly funded body and therefore should be publicly accountable. I discussed this with Professor Jane Hutton, the statistician that Cheshire Police nearly hired to work on the investigation, and she entirely agreed with this premise. The film is emblematic of this. It asks no hostile or even probing questions and contains no meaningful commentary or evidence. It is clear that Cheshire Police rapidly adopted the hypothesis that there was deliberate harm and centred their work on proving it, rather than first establishing whether a crime had actually occurred, which is what they were asked to do. Key external advice from the National Crime Agency was ignored, while Messrs Evans, Brearey and Jayaram were treated as being beyond question. The intelligence team applied methods used for clear criminal conspiracies, such as burglaries and drug rings, to medical events that might be natural or medical error, leading to misapplied analysis and confirmation bias. A key theme is the circular feedback loop. Police tell families that they suspect foul play. Families, having been told this, begin to recall or interpret events to fit that narrative, and Cheshire Police then use those family recollections as evidence that confirms the original suspicion. This process polluted memories and produced misleading testimonial evidence. Family liaison officers were heavily relied on and became central to the investigation, but they effectively prompted families, in the process amplifying trauma and creating erroneous memories. As a reminder, Family Liaison Officer Danielle Stonier later interviewed Lucy, which mixes advocacy and investigative roles and certainly compromises impartiality. Ultimately, Cheshire Police conducted a fatally flawed, emotionally driven investigation that prioritised delivering a result for families and the optics of success over rigorous multidisciplinary fact-finding and the appropriate and thorough examination of all possibilities. In addition to that, I'd also like to discuss 17 things that Cheshire Police have done as part of Operation Hummingbird that we have now established. Number 1, they allowed Brearey and Jayaram to walk into Blacon Police Station on the 15th of May 2017 and completely reverse the direction of the investigation. Number 2, they almost immediately fed the intention to investigate to the press, resulting in multiple media reports just 3 days after Cheshire Police stated that they had no intention of investigating. Number 3, the first thing Cheshire Police did in the investigation, according to the account of Paul Hughes, was to contact the families. It seems quite clear from their own words that they polluted the perspective of the families, none of whom had previously suspected or reported any indication of malfeasance. Number 4, Cheshire Police then later cited the recollections from families which they had prompted as evidence of murder. These eyewitness accounts would later appear in the court case. Number 5, they allowed Dr. Danielle Evans to meet with them when Evans had been very much the instigator. Many consider this to be poor practice. Number 6, they then allowed Evans to decide in what was, at the very most, 10 minutes and probably less than 10 minutes, that there was definitely deliberate harm and then allowed this to direct the whole investigation. Number 7. They manifestly failed to investigate any other possibility other than malfeasance from Lucy Letby. Number 8. Indeed, Brearey and Jayaram had absolutely identified Lucy Letby at the 15th of May meeting. Number 9. We know now that Dr. Evans was made aware of the existence of a nurse and is asking questions about the location of that nurse during his so-called medical review. Number 10. Later, Dr. Evans would submit at least 25 reports after he definitely knew the name of Lucy Letby following her arrest in 2018. The police didn't question this for 1 second. Number 11. They arrested Lucy Letby having only had input from Dr. Dewi Evans. This is despite the fact that the National Crime Agency made multiple recommendations regarding other specialists that should have been involved, all of which were ignored by Cheshire Police. Number 12. It is very clear that Cheshire Police allowed Dr. Evans to hand-wave any input from anyone else, any need to contextually understand the hospital, and any information from previous reviews, such as the RCPCH report. Number 13. They never made any effort to contextually understand what had occurred at the hospital. Equally, no effort was made to investigate the grievance procedure, and there was seemingly no questioning of the motives of Brearey and Jayaram. Number 14. They then actively involved Dr. Brearey and Dr. Jayaram, the accusers of Lucy Letby, in the investigation of Lucy Letby. This cannot be described as an investigation of the Countess of Chester, although this wouldn't make involving the consultants any better because the police never investigated anything other than Lucy Letby. In fact, they didn't even investigate that, they just set out to prove the hypothesis that was handed to them. Number 15. Having condemned Lucy Letby to 14 life sentences, Cheshire Police would then describe Brearey and Jayaram as the golden thread in the investigation. Number 16. Jayaram would then play a central role in securing a 15th life sentence in the retrial regarding Child K. It is clear that the evidence given by Jayaram was highly unreliable, yet there is no indication that Cheshire Police uncovered this or even bothered to question anything that Jayaram said. Number 17. Sir David Davies requested that Cheshire Police investigate Jayaram for perjury. We have yet to hear back from them. In fact, we haven't heard much at all from Cheshire Police recently. They're too embarrassed and discredited to even update their local community on traffic issues. So the last thing that I want viewers to reflect on is that we only know all of this, and I'm sure there are other points as well, because of Cheshire Police. This all comes from their own documents, the promotional film analysed in this video, and statements made to the media. We can only guess at what we don't know that lies lurking beneath the surface. Finally, I just wanted to mention that you can sign up for updates on my book. I've put a link in the comments section. A few people have asked me about this recently. As the timeline accelerates towards the release of this book, I will obviously make more videos updating you and providing you with additional information. But for the time being, you can enter your email address here and receive updates. Just in case people don't know, this book is going to be published by the publishers that previously published Nick Wallace's book on the Post Office inquiry. Cinto Press is an imprint of Bath Publishing which published that book. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any comments, queries or questions, please do leave them, and thank you for watching.